Hey there, everybody. My name's Lewis. Welcome to another episode of Lewis Too Much Analyzes Comics. I'm actually not going to be analyzing a comic today, or really anything related to superheroes. I had a request in my comments section that if I am going to be doing this series, which I am going to be doing, where I personality type superheroes, that I should probably explain where it is that I'm getting this typing model, right? And I thought that was an excellent suggestion by the person who left that comment, and so that's what I'm going to be doing today. So before I get started though, one thing that I want to make sure to say is that all of this information, I got it from another YouTube channel called C.S. Joseph. Now, C.S. Joseph, he's a life coach. You can hire him. I have never personally hired him, but you can hire him to type you. You can hire him to give you life advice based on his knowledge of the personality types. Ultimately, that channel, it kills it. If you want to go really deep into everything that I'm going to talk about today, go to that channel. I'll link it in the description. C.S. Joseph, that guy is the man. If he ever sees this, I really respect you, sir, and I appreciate everything that you have done. Ultimately, you have expanded my mind, and so I very much appreciate it. So please make sure to, if you enjoy anything that you hear today, that you go over to C.S. Joseph's channel. All right. That being said, let's go into kind of like the background behind these personality type models, and then we'll get into the personality model itself, okay? So to start off, where do these ideas come from? All right, so for the most part, as far as I'm aware, they come from Carl Jung to begin with. Now, Carl Jung, if you're into personalities at all, you've at the very least heard of Carl Jung. He was a disciple of Freud's. Eventually, they ended up separating. It's kind of controversial over what exactly they separated over. For sure, one of the major things that they separated over was their view on religion and also their view on the unconscious part of the mind. So Freud actually had a very rich understanding of the unconscious of the mind. Jung expanded that exponentially. And so Jung ultimately believed that one of the big sources of conflict between Freud and Jung was that Freud was an avowed atheist, and he thought that we essentially needed to move past religion and progress based on a purely materialistic framework of the world, versus Jung, who actually believed that religion was very important and that it was the source of a lot of unconscious symbolism, and it was trying to get in tune with very deep parts of ourself, and that it connected people in a way that ultimately is necessary. Now, I won't get into that whole debate, but basically that's one of the reasons that Jung and Freud separated. Now, ultimately, Jung goes off by himself, right, and he develops his own psychology practice, and he starts making his own observations, coming up with his own theories, his own personality models. And so one of the major contributions that Jung makes, and it's something that ultimately has permeated our culture, is the idea of introversion and extroversion. So introverts are humans who tend to be inwardly focused, and extroverts tend to be people who are externally focused. And so they derive their energy, and by that, don't think of it like chi energy or something like that. I mean, if you want to, if that helps you, feel free. But ultimately, what it's really talking about is, like, you know, as you get older, you have less energy, right? You get tired more often. It's that sort of energy that you want to think of, right? So like introverts derive their energy from spending time alone. Extroverts derive their energy from interacting with the external world. And so that's one of the major contributions that Jung makes. One of the other contributions that's a little bit less stated because of the duo that I'm going to talk about next is his observation about different archetypes as far as perceiving the world and making decisions in the world. And so this is something that that Jung discussed as certain people could be categorized as sensors versus categorized as intuitives, and there were certain people that could be categorized as thinkers versus being categorized as feelers. And so I'm going to get into the specifics of that in a little bit. But as Jung was coming up with these ideas, he ends up publishing a paper where he makes the claim that people can be categorized in this way. There's this other psychologist whose name is Isabel Myers, and she reads Jung's paper. She had been noticing some of the same things in her own patients, and she ends up coming up with the MBTI model. So her name is Isabel Myers. Her daughter is named Catherine Briggs. They ultimately team up to develop the MBTI, which is the Myers-Briggs typing instrument. So the instrument is the test that, again, that is very popular right now. Many people will take the test, right, and then it's going to give you those 4 letters. It's going to tell you that you're an ENFJ, and it's going to give you kind of a general description. It's going to tell you that you're an ESTJ. It's going to give you a general description. You're an ISTP, general description, so on and so forth, right? Now, personally, I was convinced by C.S. Joseph that the MBTI model is kind of outdated, and that doesn't make it bad. It just means that there's fresher information that takes the theory to the next level, right? And so that theory is ultimately developed by a doctor named John Beebe, who actually went back to Jung's original work and utilized Jung's original work to greatly expand upon the MBTI model. And so what Beebe claimed is that essentially all of us have these functions inside of our mind. And so our mind links to our body in these different ways, both to the internal parts of our body and through the external experience of our body. And so it does so through these 8 cognitive functions or 8 cognitive attitudes. And so based on which of these functions operates at the highest level of intensity for you, it essentially determines the order in which you're going to utilize that function. And based on that order, it's going to give that function a certain sort of disposition. And based on that, and so based on the order of the functions and the dispositions of each of the functions, that's going to determine your personality. So your personality is ultimately made up, right, of your interests, your decision making, the way that you experience reality, all those kinds of things, right? So all those things are decided by your personality. Now, really quick, before I get into all of the functions and all of that, that doesn't mean that if, let's say that you are an ENFJ, that all ENFJs are exactly the same. What it does mean is that you perceive the world exactly the same as other ENFJs, but based on your experiences, certain functions will develop at different levels of intensity for you, and ultimately, an ENFJ that has perfect parents that sends them to school, and they get hyper developed, and so on and so forth, right? Like that ENFJ is going to be very different than somebody that's like traumatized as a child when they're 5 years old and spends their entire life like bouncing between foster homes and ultimately like joins a gang when they're 14 or whatever the case may be. That ENFJ, even though they're experiencing the world and making decisions the same way that the other ENFJ would, ultimately that person is going to be a very different person than the other ENFJ, right? And it might be the case that actually if you have a harder upbringing, that you will actually be a much wiser version of that personality than the personality that's actually coddled and gets all kinds of benefits throughout their life. Okay? So let's go ahead and get into the personalities after having said that just because you get categorized as a certain personality, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of people that are categorized within that personality are exactly the same, okay? And that goes especially out to you extroverted intuitives, which I'll talk about in just a second. All right, so there's, like I said, there's these 8 cognitive functions, and those 8 cognitive functions can be subdivided into perceiving functions and judging functions, and then within the perceiving functions, there are sensing functions and intuitive functions. Within the judging functions, there are thinking functions and feeling functions. And each of the functions has an extroverted and an introverted version of itself. If you are an extrovert, you will lead with an extroverted function. If you are an introvert, you will lead with an introverted function. What do I mean by lead? That means that your top function, the most intense function in your mind, will be either extroverted or introverted. So what do each of these functions do? Because all of us have all 8 of the functions swimming around inside of our mind. But again, based on their intensity, they're going to have a certain disposition. Okay, so let's start off with the perceiving functions. The easiest of the functions, at least for me to explain, is extroverted sensing. So extroverted sensing is your mind's connection to tangible reality, and the way that you experience the world is through your 5 senses. So high extroverted sensors are experiencing reality experiencing tangible reality through their 5 senses, and that's their preferred mode of experiencing the world. So what do I mean by that? So what I mean is the experience of touch, the experience of taste, the experience of smell. This is going to be very important to them. And what happens to very high extroverted sensors is that they will actually want to move from sensory experience to sensory experience. They're very reality based, so they're not really into the meaning behind things. They're very much into what is versus the potential realities and all that kind of stuff. We'll get into that when we get into the intuitives. They're very much about tangible reality. Now, extroverted sensors in specific are very much about the present moment. So whatever moment they're in right now, that's what they're experiencing. And so they're not very good about projecting out into the future, and they're not very good about looking back into the past. So again, they're living in the now. They're very now focused. So what does that look like in reality? What's an example of that, right? So a high extroverted sensor, somebody that has extroverted sensing as their top function, number one, on the positive end, right? So on the positive end, they're going to be a party animal, right? They are going to be super fun people because they're going to want to experience all kinds of new things, and they're going to want to take you along as they experience all kinds of new things because of the fact that they're going to be extroverted. They want to share their tactile sensory experiences with as many people as they humanly can. And so on the positive side of things, they're very fun. If you're with them, they're filled with energy. They brim over with with energy because they're all about trying to have these different experiences constantly, right? Now, on the negative end of that, like I said, they're not very good about projecting consequences out into the future or learning from past experiences. And so because of that situation, a really quick example of what can happen to them is, right, they go to the mall, they're at the mall, they intended to go to the mall to buy this one specific dress, right? They find the dress, but as they're trying on the dress, they look, and now they see this bright colored dress over here. That bright color starts calling to their senses, and so they run over, they see that other dress, and they pick that one. Oh, this one looks nice too. You know what? I can buy both of these dresses. And then as they're getting both of the dresses on their arm, they turn their head and they see another dress over here. They walk over, they inspect it. Again, the color is calling out to them. They're, you know what? I can do this dress too. And then as they're putting on the other dress, the whiff of perfume from the perfume section starts coming over to them. They walk over to the perfume section, and all of a sudden, like 2 hours later, they've spent $2,000 at the mall that they didn't have, and all of a sudden they're at home, and they don't realize until they're home that they've made a big mistake. And maybe even then they still realize that they made a big mistake until they try and cash another check, until they try and write another check or swipe their debit card at another place, right? And they have no money in the bank account. So that's what extroverted sensing does. It's all about living in the present. Okay, so let's contrast that now to introverted sensing. So one of the things about the introverted, something to know about the introverted functions is that, versus the extroverted functions, is that the extroverted functions want to kind of like push everything outward into the external world. The introverted functions are always trying to like narrow things down and like collapse them into as narrow a path as possible. So what introverted sensing does is introverted sensing is also a very tactile function. So people that are high introverted sensors are very practical people, but to contrast that with extroverted sensing, what introverted sensors do is they map their present tactile experience and then they compare it to past sensory experiences. And because they're comparing it to past sensory experiences, what they'll do is they'll essentially generate in their mind this kind of like hierarchy of sensory experiences. And so once they've achieved a certain number of sensory experiences, they will not want to break away from that hierarchy of sensory experiences, because for them they can actually very easily recall their past sensory experiences. And so if they are engaging in a new sensory experience, and it doesn't match up to the hierarchy in their head, to the pleasure of past sensory experiences, they essentially will say, no, I don't want to do that. And so what can happen and so essentially what introverted sensors will do is generate a process of routines, and essentially stick to those routines, because those are the best way of doing things, and they'll essentially govern their life based on like those like high quality sensory experiences that they've had. And so again, they'll be very routine based. Now, because of this, because they're so routine based, and because they don't really want to break away and experience new sensations, number one, they'll be very loyal. So when they're engaged in a relationship, once they have settled in their mind that this person is a good person to be with, they will stick with that person as as long as possible, because again, they don't really want to break away and engage in new sensory experiences. So they'll be very loyal to that person. Now that can be very good, for them to be loyal, but it can also have its negative side, in the sense that if they're caught in a really bad relationship, they may find it very difficult to break away from that relationship, because again, they'll get stuck in that routine. The other thing that introverted sensing will do is, if they are in a like I said, in a bad situation, they are built to endure suffering, because once they get into that routine, again, they don't want to escape that routine. And so even if they're in a bad situation, they will withstand that suffering and just stand there like a rock, taking that suffering. And so introverted sensing, if you want to compare it to extroverted sensing is like a tornado, right? It's like tearing through the town. Introverted sensing is like a rock. And so the extroverted sensor is like blowing all around them, and they're just sitting there standing firm. And so introverted sensors and extroverted sensors can make really good friends, actually, because the extroverted sensor will pull the introverted sensor into new experiences, and that's very good for the introverted sensor sometimes, because again, the introverted sensor doesn't really want those new experiences, but they do need those new experiences, because if not, they'll get stuck in the monotony of that routine. And so again, it's they're very practical. They're very tactile. They're built to last. They're built to be loyal. So that's essentially what introverted sensing does. All right. Now, extroverted intuition is next. So now we're going to move on to our intuitive friends. I actually am an intuitive. I am an introverted intuitive. Extroverted intuition is a pattern detecting mechanism in the mind. Again, all of us have intuition inside of our mind. It's just that it depends on what level of intensity that's going to give it a certain disposition. And so extroverted intuition, what it does is it picks up patterns in the environment. Now, it depends on which of these functions it gets paired with, what kinds of patterns it's going to pick up. But ultimately, that's what it's doing. It's picking up patterns in the environment. And then, like I said, extroverted functions are all about like broadening things out. And so extroverted intuition, what it's trying to do is it picks up on these patterns. And so let's say, right, that it's built this nice little puzzle, right? What extroverted intuition will want to do is spread all the puzzle pieces all over the table, and then take each individual puzzle piece and then see if it fits with any puzzle pieces from other puzzles. And so it'll try and build all kinds of new puzzles from each of the pieces. And so it's very concerned with what if scenarios. So it's like, okay, so I detected this pattern, but what if I blow up the pattern and then take pieces of the pattern and then ask those pieces, well, what if I change this? 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 And so, like, a perfect illustration of this is if you've ever seen Avengers Infinity War, when Doctor Strange is meditating and he starts seeing all these different potential realities, and he cycles through like a million realities and realizes that there's only one valid reality. That's essentially what extroverted intuition does, is it cycles through all potential realities, and it's doing this unconsciously. It's not even, it's not something that an extroverted intuitive will summon. It's something that'll just happen, right? And so extroverted intuition is, like, if you want to summarize it, it's an idea generator. It is intense creativity. It's all about like generating new ideas, the novel ideas. And so extroverted intuitives are going to be really, really good at generating ideas. They're going to be very creative. Now, on the negative side of extroverted intuition, what can happen is extroverted intuitives and introverted intuitives, by the way, live in their heads because they live in this reality, or it's not reality. They're living in their imagination, essentially, because their mind is picking up on all these patterns unconsciously and like breaking apart the pattern and all that kind of stuff. And so they're not living in tangible reality. They're living in these potential futures, and they might live in a bunch of different potential futures all at the same time because they're trying to figure out which of these is going to be the best. And what if I change this over here? What if I change this over here? And so they'll live in their imagination. And so on the negative side of that, what can happen is that they will lose things all the time. They're not rooted in reality, and so they'll bump into things. They'll get home. They'll be in their imagination, and then they'll like throw their wallet somewhere, and it like flies behind the couch, and they don't even realize that it's flying behind the couch because again, they're in their imagination. Their house is a complete mess, and they don't realize it because they're not living in their house. They're living in some magical fantasy land that they've crafted in their head. Now again, I'm kind of making fun of the intuitive function there, but again, I'm an intuitive. Like, I know that I'm like this. This is how I am. So that's kind of the bad version of, or the bad side of extroverted intuition, is that it can be all over the place and not be rooted in reality. All right, so then let's finish the perceiving functions with introverted intuition. This is actually my top function, and so I experience it all the time. I know very much what this feels like. So introverted intuition is, again, think of the introverted functions as narrowing, right? In comparison to the extroverted functions that want to blow things apart or that want to expand things, right? They expand outward. So the introverted intuition, what it does is it does the same thing as extroverted intuition in that it's picking up patterns in the environment unconsciously. And so introverted intuitives, as they're walking through life, they're picking up on patterns in the environment without noticing. And so that's how they're experiencing reality. It's by picking up on these patterns. But instead of blowing apart the pattern, it's actually trying to narrow down the pattern. And so what introverted intuitives, if if they could have their deepest desire, it would be to basically boil all the patterns in all of the world into one meta pattern, into one gigantic meta pattern. And so introverted intuitives are going to, one of the things that they're really going to like is things like history, things like, some types of philosophy, the kind of narrowing philosophies, not the expanding philosophies, which are more for extroverted intuitives. So the philosophies that narrow, introverted intuitives are going to love that. And so introverted intuitives, again, they're all about narrowing things to that one thing. They're all about narrowing all ideas into one giant idea. They're all about narrowing all the patterns into one meta pattern. So there's one meta story to history, right? There's one there's one pathway to live your life by. So that's the other thing that introverted intuition does, is it tries to narrow everything down into one, so that way the introverted intuitive can determine for themselves which is the best pathway forward, or what is, I mean, it's a somewhat subjective function, but what is the best pathway forward to them, and then what they'll do is they'll actually pursue that pathway with intense determination, because introverted intuition is very myopic. It'll narrow things down into that one point, and so once it narrows down into that one point, the introverted intuitive will pursue that one point with everything that they have. Introverted intuition is very concerned with meaning, and so it's trying to pick up on the meaning behind things. So as people are talking to introverted intuitives, what introverted intuitives are doing is they are listening, but they're trying to actually pierce through your words and detect the meaning behind the words. So they don't actually take your words at face value. They want to know what is behind the words that are being spoken to them. And so that's what introverted intuition does. On the positive end, it makes them very determined, very willful. They're very goal-oriented. On the negative side, they have some of the same negative as extroverted intuition, in that they're all up in their head, right? And they're not really paying attention to what's going on in reality. The other negative, though, is that they can become too myopic sometimes and focus on that one path without recognizing that there's other paths and that other people can live their life in different ways. And so that's another one of the concerns or downfalls of introverted intuition. Okay, so those are the perceiving functions. Again, the perceiving functions are all about how you experience the world. And that's going to, so basically your mind is taking in information via these perceiving functions. Now, it needs to know what to do with all of that information that it has been taking in, right? And so that's when your mind is going to turn to the judging functions. And so the judging functions are, again, broken down into thinking and feeling functions. And of course, there's an extroverted and introverted version of each one. All right. So the first of the judging functions is extroverted thinking. Now, extroverted thinking, the way that it works is it kind of, what it does actually is outsource its thinking. And I don't actually mean that in a negative way, in the sense that it's like, oh, they can't think for themselves. But really what they do is they're very efficient thinkers. And so extroverted thinking is all about efficiency and order and structure. And so what they'll do is they will bounce ideas off of all of the people around them. This is why I say that they outsource their thinking. And then based on the information that's given back to them, then they can now generate the most effective and efficient system of order. And so extroverted thinking, again, really the best way to think about it is as a large-scale system of order. It's trying to impose a system of order on their surrounding environment. Now, because of the fact that they're bouncing ideas off of other people, extroverted thinkers can be very argumentative, because naturally the way that they talk is to bounce ideas off of people and debate each of those ideas, because what they're trying to do, again, is arrive at the best system of order. Now, all of these functions ultimately are somewhat subjective, and so, like I said, and each of them has their positives and negatives. So extroverted thinking, because it's so efficient, what it'll sometimes do is actually cut corners. Now, that can sometimes be good, because they're getting to that end result as quickly as possible. And again, what they want to do is get to that system of order. But on the negative side of that, they can sometimes neglect some of the details. And honestly, like, if in terms of like what that looks like in reality, so a lot of politicians are going to be extroverted thinkers. A lot of high-end like CEOs are going to be extroverted thinkers. Actually, a lot of athletes are also extroverted thinkers, because extroverted thinkers are very competitive. because of that natural tendency to debate. They may debate intellectually, or they may debate like with their, like, honestly, extroverted thinkers are competitive. Like, no matter what even if they're playing Monopoly, extroverted thinkers, they'll get into that game, and they will try and be as efficient as possible and try to win as quickly as possible. That's what extroverted thinkers do. So on the positive end of that, right, again, they're very efficient, but on the negative side of that, they can miss some of the details, and also sometimes they can come off as very uncaring, because to them, really, like, they're not all that concerned with how they're making you feel. They're concerned with getting to the most efficient system possible. And so that, again, that can make them come off as not not very fun to be around sometimes, because they really want to impose order on all of the people that are around them. And so extroverted thinkers just need to be aware of that. That is actually going to somewhat be similar to introverted thinkers, high introverted thinkers. So introverted thinkers, again, remember, extroverted, all about expanding; introverted, all about narrowing. So introverted thinking is, it's still a thinking function. It's very calculating, the same way that extroverted thinking is. But introverted thinking is much more process oriented, and it's all about getting to the truth. That's actually ultimately what introverted thinking is all about. It wants to get to the truth, to facts. And what it'll do is it'll start at a premise, so it'll work from a premise all the way out to its logical conclusion. And so introverted thinking is deeply tied into logic, actually, to the logic centers of the brain. And so it's essentially designed to problem solve, and it'll problem solve in a very methodical way. So it's going to need, again, to start with a premise and work from that premise all the way to the conclusion. So where extroverted thinking is all about efficiency, introverted thinking is all about that process and getting to the most accurate answer. And so high introverted thinkers can also come off sometimes very cold, because ultimately for them, all that matters is the truth. And so if they're going to if you have a problem, what they want to do is just tell you the truth. And it really doesn't matter how they make you feel in that moment, because they need to tell you the truth. Now, again, all the functions are subjective. So sometimes the truth to them can be a subjective truth. And because if they start with a bad premise, they'll actually work from that bad premise all the way out to its logical conclusion. So again, none of these functions are foolproof, right? Like, we're human beings, we're organic creatures. We're not ultimately designed to be perfect in any one area, right? And so introverted thinking, on the positive end, it's a lot more concerned with details. And so in comparison to extroverted thinking, it'll take more details into consideration, and it'll be much more, like I said, like, it'll develop ideas via a process versus develop ideas via efficiency, where it's like, well, if I just need to cut some corners here and there, and I mean, as long as I get to that system, we're good. And so that's kind of how the two compare to each other. All right, so then that's going to take us now to our feely types. I am a feely type. And so the two feely types are going to be the extroverted feelers and the introverted feelers. So extroverted feeling is, again, outwardly focused. It's expanding outward. So extroverted feeling is a decision-making function, where what it does is it's taking into consideration the feelings of the people that are around them, and it makes decisions based on the feelings of people around them. And so what extroverted feelers prize more than anything is harmony in the environment. Both of the feeling types are typically going to not like conflict very much, but extroverted feelers especially do not like conflict, because, again, for them it's like a violation of that harmonious desire that they have. And so extroverted feelers, a lot of times actually will not be super aware of their own feelings. To a degree they are, but ultimately they base their feelings a lot more on the interpretation of what they think other people around them are feeling. And so what do I mean by that? So an extroverted feeler walks into a room and everybody in the room has a sad face, right? Now, what's possible is that everyone in that room is an introverted thinker, and introverted thinkers typically have this face when they're thinking. Now, an extroverted feeler is going to walk into the room and see that face on everybody's face, and they are going to think to themselves, everybody here is sad. I need to make everybody happy. I need to make everybody feel good. And so the extroverted feeler is going to go around and do their best to try and make those people feel good. Now, it may actually work, or it may actually annoy them, depending on, you know, what it was that they were thinking about, right? And so extroverted feelers are dependent on their external reading of other people to determine essentially how they feel. And so what extroverted feelers are doing all the time is they're sacrificing for others. They're giving of themselves for others. They're that friend, right, that's gonna like pick you up at the bar at 3 in the morning. Those are gonna be extroverted feelers because for them, self-sacrifice is hyper important. They're going to be willing to forgive huge scale wrongs done to them as long as they can preserve that social harmony. Now, on the good side of that, right, is they're very self-sacrificial. They care about other people. A lot of nurses are going to be extroverted feelers. Psychologists, a lot of the times, are going to be extroverted feelers. That kind of thing, right? So they're people that care about other people. But on the negative side of that, because they're so conflict avoidant and because they're so self-sacrificing, they can get walked all over. And what will happen is, if they get walked all over for too long, they start to build up resentment inside of them, and then eventually they're that person that snaps and like turns into a psychopath because they've been sacrificing for other people for so long that essentially, like, eventually they cave in because they have not had their own feelings attended to. And that's actually a downfall of extroverted feelers, is that they don't attend to their own feelings. And by the way, I'm an extroverted feeler, so I'm preaching to myself on that. All right, so then the last of the judging functions is introverted feeling. Introverted feeling is essentially your mind's connection to your own emotions and to your own personal emotions. And so high introverted feelers experience their own emotions very intensely and very potently. So high introverted feelers are very passionate people. So a lot of artists are going to be high introverted feelers, poets, musicians, that kind of thing. A lot of them are going to be like cooks. I've never met a high introverted feeler that isn't a super good cook. Just me. I haven't met one. So high. That doesn't mean that other types can't be good cooks, but high introverted feelers, it's like they set the bar. At least for me, I haven't met one yet that isn't a good cook. So they'll feel very passionately. When they experience anger, they're very angry. When they're in love, they're very in love. And so every emotional experience for them is like a very intense emotional experience. Now, because introverted feeling is essentially connected to your own personal emotions, it also generates a sense of morality in people, because what happens, right, is introverted feelers will get wronged, for example. That's a really easy example for an introverted feeler. So they'll get wronged. Let's say they get cheated on or something like that. They experience that betrayal very intensely, right? And so now, because they experience it so intensely, they will want justice to be done, and so they'll become very justice oriented in that moment. It'll be very, very, very justice bordering on revenge is the best way to think about it. And so they'll become very justice oriented and want any wrongs done to them to be righted. But it's not just to them, because introverted feelers are so in tune with their own emotions. They are also really good about picking up on other people's emotions. Actually, in certain ways, better than extroverted feelers, because again, extroverted feelers are doing it based on how they're reading people. Now, extroverted feelers, because they're doing this their whole life, tend to get good at reading other people, right? Because they've been making decisions based on other people's emotions their whole life. So it's not that they can't read other people. Both of the feeler types tend to be pretty good about reading people, but because introverted feelers are so in tune with their own emotions, they can recognize much more accurately what the emotions that other people are experiencing are. So again, in that example where I said that the extroverted feeler, right, it walks into a room and everybody has a straight face, it's not necessarily that they're sad, it's that maybe they're just thinking or whatever, right? The introverted feeler will be much more in tune with that and just be like, oh, okay, yeah, they're just thinking, you know, it's not like a bit, they're not sad. I know what sadness feels like. I know what sadness, the experience of sadness is like, and that's not what it is. And so they'll have that in tuneness with other people's emotions. And so not only are they justice oriented towards themselves, they'll be very justice oriented just in the world in general. So when injustices are happening, introverted feelers cannot stand that, and so they will go out and crusade in order to make sure that those injustices are righted. And so introverted feeling is very tied into personal morality. And so introverted feelers typically are going to have a very high moral standard. One of the other things that introverted feeling is tied into is actually your own personal value. So your value tends to be connected to how intensely you experience your emotions. And so high introverted feelers are going to value themselves fairly highly. Now, here are the positives, right, of introverted feeling. So introverted feeling, I talked about a whole bunch of the positives, is that they're very passionate, and so they'll pour their passion into things. They're very moral people, typically, unless they get corrupted, but typically they're going to be very moral people. Now, on the negative end of that, they can fall over into that revenge mode, right? If when it comes to injustices and things like that, they'll start desiring revenge, and they can get resentful too, the same way that the extroverted feelers can get resentful. Because they esteem themselves so highly, that's another downfall sometimes of high introverted feelers, is that they can prioritize their own emotions over the emotions of others, and at times become very selfish with that introverted, with that need for their emotions to be satisfied versus satisfying other people's emotions. And so that's going to be typically more when they're in a bad state. So if they've been betrayed or something like that, that's going to be the sort of situation where that occurs. Okay? All right. So those are the 8 cognitive functions. Now, depending on how they stack up, that's going to determine essentially the prism through which you experience reality and the manner in which you make decisions in the world. And so in BB's model, there's 8 functions in total, right? And so they line up in a certain order, and so they essentially line up in order of intensity from 1 to 4, and then from 5 to 8. And so the top 4 functions are going to all fall into your conscious mind. And so what that means is that you essentially have control over those functions, because you have control over your conscious mind, versus the last 4 functions, which are going to fall into the unconscious part of your mind. And so the top function is going to mirror the 5th function, and the 2nd function is going to mirror the 6th function, the 3rd function is going to mirror the 7th function, and the 4th function is going to mirror the 8th function. I'm going to pause the video right now, and I'm going to erase the whiteboard, and I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like. All right, so resuming the video here, you can see here that essentially what's going to happen, right, is you are going to have one of these functions as your top function. Now, these functions operate on an axis, and so the way that they work is if you have extroverted sensing, you also have introverted intuition in your ego. If you have introverted sensing in your ego, you're also going to have extroverted intuition. And I'm going to show you how that works over here, okay? So pretty much, let's say, just for example, that you have extroverted sensing as your top function. So automatically, if you have extroverted sensing in your top function, what's going to happen is your last function, your inferior function, is going to be introverted intuition. Now let's say that you have, so you're going to have two perceiving functions in your ego, and you're going to have two decision making or judging functions in your ego. So let's say that then you have introverted feeling as your next function. By the way, the functions also work like this. They start extroverted, then introverted, extroverted, introverted, or the opposite, right? So if you're an introvert, introverted, extroverted, introverted, extroverted. Okay? So let's say that you have introverted feeling as your primary decision-making function. Automatically, your third function is going to be extroverted thinking. Now, what's going to happen is in your unconscious is the opposite of this function is going to fall here. The opposite of this function is going to fall here. So we'll do it like this. So introverted sensing, extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, and extroverted intuition. All right. Now, if you notice, I listed these words here. These are the dispositions that I was referring to before. So each of the functions, depending on its intensity, is going to have a certain sort of disposition to it. So what that looks like is the top function is considered your hero function because it acts like a hero. And it's not like a superhero. It's very much like an old school hero that wants glory, right? It saves the villagers. It wants glory. And so it wants to be recognized. So it is an excellent function. It's very competent. It's very capable, but it also wants attention and wants glory. And so it tinges it with a very positive orientation, but also kind of like a needing recognition sort of orientation. And so for an extroverted sensor, what that's going to look like is they are going to always look good. They are going to always smell good. They are going to be all about giving you a good sensory experience. So again, they're going to clean their house. They're going to have really good hand-eye coordination, all that good stuff, right? But they're also going to want to be recognized for looking good. They want you to tell them, hey, you look good. And they're actually going to almost think to themselves all the time, I look good. So it has that kind of like arrogant function to it, right? Or that arrogant disposition to it. So let's say, now the next of the dispositions is the parent. So the parent is your second function. It works, it's almost as intense as your top function, but not quite. And so it has more of a responsible orientation. And so it tinges whatever function falls there with a sense of responsibility. And so for, let's say that you have introverted feeling as your parent function, remember, introverted feeling is all about morality, right? So what it'll do to somebody that has introverted feeling as their parent function is it'll tinge their morality with a sense of, I need to, number one, be responsible with my emotions. Even though I get very emotional because it's such a high function, I get very emotional and I make all my decisions, not all the decisions, but a large degree of my decisions based on my emotions. So I am very emotional, but if you tell me, hey, you need to get your emotions under control, that will speak to the parental element of the introverted function. And so it'll become almost like a duty to keep the emotions under control. Next, you're going to have the child function. In psychology terms, this is really your inner child, right? And so whatever function falls there, it's going to have a childish, naive disposition. And that's both positive and negative, right? So it'll have like a very naive, innocent way of approaching that function, a very playful way. So it'll enjoy that function. So that function will be very pleasurable for them to use, but they'll also utilize it in a pleasurable way. So it's not so much like the hero function where it's trying to conquer the world. The child is really trying to like just play with that function. And so for an extroverted thinker, if you remember, it's all about systems and order and imposing regulations and all of that kind of stuff. Because it has a childish disposition, what it'll do is it'll impose systems of order, but in a very like innocent and sweet way. And so like I have a friend who has this function stack. This is the ESFP. What they'll utilize their extroverted thinking for is actually to like plan parties. And when they're planning parties, they will not be rigid at all. Like they will actually get you to want to do what they tell you to do, versus an extroverted thinking hero that will just tell you that this is what you need to do. Okay? So that's kind of how the child works. The next is your inferior function. So the inferior function is the weakest of the functions in your ego. And so because of that, it basically makes it like a bumbling hero that trips on his own cape. This hero will, or this function will not function very well and will typically get you into trouble during the course of your life, because it'll try and like come out and then it'll like tumble over itself and get you into trouble, and then everybody's going to criticize you about that function. And so typically your insecurities are very deeply tied to your inferior function, because it's gotten you into trouble so many times during the course of your life. So the inferior function is also, because it doesn't work very well in you, typically when you see it operating well in others, you can react to it one of two ways. If you're very insecure, you may get jealous when you see it operating well in others, or you may view it, if you have a little bit more self-awareness and you're trying to become a better person, right? You may see that function operating in somebody else and actually aspire to be like that person and look at that person, with the good sort of envy, right? That it's like, oh, I want to be like that person. I can't believe that they utilize that function so well. And so what that would look like, just to use introverted intuition as an example. So introverted intuition is all about narrowing things down to that one pathway. It's all about pattern detecting and predicting into the future, so that the introverted intuitive can follow that pathway into the future. So what will happen is introverted intuition won't work very well for extroverted sensors, and so this is why they're not very good at predicting consequences, and it's also why they'll make the same mistake over and over and over, because they're not picking up on the patterns of their own mistakes. And so that's essentially how it'll look like as an inferior function. Now, they can develop that function, but it's going to take a lot of discipline and a lot of self-awareness in order to develop that function, and surrounding yourself with people who utilize this function much better than you do. Okay? Now, in the unconscious, you essentially also have these functions operate at a high level of intensity, but what they do is they kind of oppose their corresponding function. All right? And so what that looks like is, the reason that it's called the villain is because it antagonizes the hero, and so it confronts the hero with its downfalls. And so for an extroverted sensor, introverted sensing is mapping, past sensory experiences, right? And so what it'll do is it'll confront the extroverted sensor with the reality that, hey, you living in the moment, remember all these times that it got us in trouble in the past? Now, because it's happening in the unconscious mind, it's not something that the extroverted sensor can bring forth. It'll be something more that screams at them from the back of their head, and the more times that their extroverted sensing gets them into trouble, the more experiences that introverted sensing can map onto that unconscious part of them. And so the more the more that they develop their introverted intuition and pick up on patterns, the more that introverted sensing can then tell them, hey, this is a problem that you're about to get into right here. Now, their default mode is to just give in to whatever pleasurable sensory experience they're engaging in at the moment. But introverted sensing is going to tell them, hey, I know that this feels good right now, but we got to retreat. You got to remember all those times that doing that impulsive thing that you're doing got you into trouble. Okay? The next function is the critic function, and it has a critical disposition. And so what it'll do is it'll basically confront the parent. So introverted feeling, again, this is the ESFP. So introverted feeling ESFP is very concerned with their own emotion. The critic function is going to critique the introverted feeling and tell them, hey, you need to be worried about the fact that there's other people too. Like, you can't just completely hone in on your own emotions. You have to care about the emotions of other people. So the critic criticizes you via that function. And the other thing that it'll do is it'll hold that person to a very high standard based on whatever this function is. And so in the case of an ESFP, it's going to hold them to a very high standard in terms of establishing harmony in the environment. And then what they will then in turn do is criticize anybody else that is not contributing to that harmonious environment because of the fact that the extroverted feeling is falling into that critic slot. Okay. The next is the trickster, and so the trickster, the best way to think about the trickster is that it's like static in your brain. So whichever function is here, it's not that it doesn't work. What it does is it takes that function and it like scrambles it. So it's like when you're trying to access it, it's like accessing, it's like trying to like get the antennas right, and like the signal kind of like comes in a little bit, but like it's mostly static. And so what will happen is for ESFPs that have introverted thinking as a trickster function is whenever they're trying to be logical, their ideas will essentially escape them. Their mind will just kind of go blank. And so this is why they'll need to rely on other people telling them, you know, they have to outsource their thinking to a fairly large degree. So they need other people telling them what the appropriate ideas are or what the appropriate way to resolve problems is, because their problem solving function is not, it doesn't work very, very well. And I don't mean that to be mean. This is just how all of us have a trickster that messes with us. And then finally, the demon function. So your demon function is your last function. Typically, this is the source of all your anger and rage. That's why it's called the demon function. And it'll essentially give that function a very angry, ragey disposition. And so anytime that you utilize this, that the unconscious tries to utilize this function, it'll be in a very negative way. And so you'll experience that function always through a negative prism. And so because of that, what will happen is people that utilize this function as a top function, whichever function you have here, you're typically going to view that person with some suspicion, because to you, you'll kind of interpret that person as irresponsible. I mean, it'll depend on which function this is, but for an ESFP, what they'll do is they'll view people that have high extroverted intuition as irresponsible or not living in reality, because they're living in all these potential futures. And so what will happen to an ESFP when they trigger their extroverted intuition is they will, because typically this is how your mind is going to work, right? Is introverted intuition, inferior, it didn't work, right? And so they lived too much in the moment, and so they made some giant catastrophic mistake. Introverted sensing villain now starts criticizing them for doing that and telling them, hey, you know, what about all these other times that we did the exact same thing and we messed it up every single time? Why didn't we learn our lesson from that? And then what their extroverted intuition demon will do is project outward all of the potential futures where they didn't make that mistake, and now they have all these other futures in their head that like where everything actually worked out because they didn't give in to extroverted sensing hero. And so this will basically like be a source of like, oh man, it's like all the, you know, all the potential futures that would have been better than the future that I'm living in. And so extroverted sensors typically do not want to be here, because that means that they're in a bad state, and really none of us want to be in our demon function, because that means that we're in a bad state. And so whatever function is there, again, it gets tinged with that sort of anger and negativity and all of that kind of stuff. Okay? All right. So this is a very long video. I hope that this explained the model that I'm going to be utilizing to dissect superheroes and to categorize superheroes and explain why superheroes make some of the decisions that they make and why they experience the world the way that they do. Thank you so much for listening, and I love every single one of you that listens to this video. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.